At exactly 4 in the afternoon, the funeral guests were gone. The heavy silence that followed was the first sign that the house Margaret had maintained for 42 years was no longer entirely hers. Margaret noticed the shift immediately. Her family had stopped looking at her as a grieving widow. Instead, they studied her the way you'd look at a piece of heavy furniture that you haven't quite figured out how to move yet. Her eldest son, David, was already making himself at home. He loosened his tie and surveyed the crown molding, his eyes moving with the practiced efficiency of an inspector. He didn't ask Margaret about her plans. He announced them. He told her she would be moving to the small room downstairs, so he and his wife Sarah could take the master suite upstairs while they sorted out the estate. Margaret had spent over 4 decades pouring her labor and emotion into these rooms, yet David was now dictating the geography of the house as if she were merely a guest who had overstayed her welcome. She sat perfectly still in her floral armchair, her hands folded. As they discussed her future right in front of her, Margaret realized she was being reassigned to the margins of her own life. David used the stairs as his primary justification. He claimed they were getting too difficult for her, framing her removal from the master suite as a necessary act of management. In their minds, the transition was already complete. They treated her like a temporary tenant, a fragile fixture that would eventually be cleared away to make room for what came next. Sarah began her own assessment, running a finger along the mahogany mantel to check for dust. She wasn't looking at family photos. Instead, she was calculating the square footage. Sarah urged David to start a formal inventory the following morning. With the real estate market peaking, she was worried about letting a high-value property sit idle. This was the legal reality they assumed Arthur had left behind. In their version of the trust, the house passed directly to the children, leaving Margaret with the status of a temporary life tenant until they decided otherwise. This mechanical approach to the house extended to Margaret herself. If she was a tenant, the next logical step in their inventory was finding a managed care facility where she wouldn't be a burden to the property's sale. When Margaret finally spoke, her voice didn't shake. She simply stated that she would not be moving downstairs. Slightly exasperated, David sighed heavily, insisting they needed the upstairs space to stage the rooms for a professional appraisal. Staging meant stripping the house of its character, turning 42 years of history into a sterile, marketable box that a stranger could imagine buying. Their focus on the potential check from a buyer made them forget that the person who actually held the keys and the legal authority was still sitting in the room with them. Margaret told them they could appraise the house, but she drew a hard line at the east guest room. It was a room that had remained locked for years. David dismissed the room instantly. He assumed it was a closet full of his father's old junk that needed to be cleared out and hauled to the curb. Margaret confirmed that the door was locked, but she made it clear that it would stay that way until she decided otherwise. Sarah didn't take the warning seriously. She scoffed and threatened to simply have the hinges taken off the door by the next morning. Without a word, Margaret reached into her black cardigan, pulled out a heavy brass key, and set it on the glass coffee table. She told them the room hadn't been opened since before the funeral, and until she was ready, no one, not even the appraisers, would be going inside. The sound of the key hitting the table changed the atmosphere. The confident talk of staging and sales stopped, replaced by a sudden, uncomfortable curiosity about what Arthur had left behind. Margaret watched them, knowing that the contents of that room would explain why she wasn't moving, and why their plans for the house would soon encounter a reality they never saw coming. A peculiar thing happens after a funeral. Before the grief even settles into the furniture, the remaining possessions are cataloged. For Margaret's children, a lifetime of childhood memories was quickly converted into a financial spreadsheet. They paced the hallways, mapping out their inherited equity and staking claims on antique grandfather clocks. Through this flurry of appraisals, Margaret remained entirely still. She quietly worked through a crossword puzzle while her children priced her life around her. This focus on monetization created a severe tunnel vision. By treating the house purely as an asset to be divided, the children failed to account for the woman sitting right in front of them. This floor plan shows their inventory process. Every area is tagged and accounted for, except for one room, the locked east guest room. Assuming it contained financial assets, the children believed Arthur hid valuables inside, keeping them away from the estate assessment. This assumption relied on a very specific logic. To them, Arthur handled the deed, while Margaret was the homemaker, managing the household. They viewed her silence as a lack of understanding regarding the estate's true value. Their greed had effectively written their mother out of the equation. Projecting their financial desires onto the locked door, they detached themselves from the house's reality. This dynamic came to a head on a Thursday morning. Her son, David, initiated a confrontation in the kitchen, leaning against the counter and casually holding a cup of coffee with the authority of someone who believes they are in control. He delivered a flat ultimatum. Margaret had to hand over the key immediately, or he would bring in a locksmith to force the door open. He weaponized legal jargon, citing trusts and beneficiary rights. He lectured her on holding up the legal process, operating on the certainty that a grieving widow couldn't understand property law. Margaret looked up from her crossword and told him to cancel the locksmith. She would open the door herself on Friday morning, when the estate lawyer arrived. In a few sentences, Margaret shifted the terms. She dictated the timeline for the reveal, using the very legal deadline her son had just tried to use against her. Instead of questioning this shift, the family spent the next 48 hours doubling down. They dismissed Margaret's firm boundary as drama, eager to just get the process over with. They brought in a real estate agent to begin measuring the rooms for a sale. As the agent pointed out the original hardwood floors and crown molding, he spoke exclusively to the children. They carried on their conversation as if Margaret were just another piece of the decor. The siblings continued their whispers about gold coins and bearer bonds. From her armchair, Margaret simply watched them, her hands folded, observing their anticipation in silence. They were so busy calculating their windfall that they were enthusiastically documenting every square foot of a property they assumed was theirs to sell, oblivious to the fact that they had no legal authority over the deed. This diagram shows their logic failing. Their premise relied on a hierarchy where Arthur held absolute financial control, while Margaret remained disconnected. But this was based on behavior, not facts. Because Arthur was loud, they assumed he held power, never verifying the actual deed. This gap in their logic led to a total miscalculation. They prepared for a financial discovery, ignoring the possibility that the room held Margaret's history rather than Arthur's secrets. But their confident anticipation of a payout was actually a countdown to the destruction of their own assumptions. By Thursday evening, the house was serene and sunny, masking the shift in control that had already occurred. The children were fully relaxed. They were anticipating the 9 o'clock deadline the next morning, ready to sell a house they believed they already possessed. Yet Margaret held total control. She was calmly waiting them out, while the key that would dismantle their plan rested in her pocket. Margaret's silence wasn't a sign of confusion, but of patience. By Friday morning, the children would realize that the legal control they assumed they held never actually left their mother's hands. Friday morning arrived with a cold rain lashing against the windows. Inside, an estate lawyer sat in the center of the living room, surrounded by 3 children who had spent the last few days pacing the hallways in anticipation. Margaret walked down the stairs with her back perfectly straight, a heavy antique brass key in her hand. She ignored her children and walked toward the locked door of the east guest room. She slid the key in and turned it with a sharp, echoing click. David, Sarah, and Emily stood ready with clipboards and neon sticky notes. They were prepared to inventory a windfall, chests of gold coins, hidden paintings, or bearer bonds they were certain their father had tucked away. When the door opened, the room held only the scent of old paper and dried lavender. It was a meticulously organized archive. Filing cabinets lined the walls, and thick binders filled the mahogany bookshelves, all surrounding a large drafting table in the center of the room. David let out a harsh laugh, his disappointment quickly turning to anger. He dismissed the room as nothing more than a collection of old paperwork, telling his mother they didn't have time for the drama she had created over a few files. To the children, these files were just clutter. They were already looking past the room, still expecting to find their father's empire elsewhere in the house. Margaret walked to the drafting table and opened the top binder. She told her children that the work in this room didn't belong to their father, it belonged to her. She pointed out their shared assumption that because Arthur was loud, he was the one who managed the finances and built the wealth they were so eager to claim. The reality was that Arthur's business failed 32 years ago. A catastrophic collapse left him drowning in debt and nearing foreclosure. To save the property, it was sold legally and fully to Margaret, moving the asset out of creditors' reach into her sole possession. While Arthur maintained the image of the provider, his financial standing had been hollowed out decades ago. The person who actually held the property together wasn't the man they expected. This raised a question the children hadn't considered. How did a quiet housewife manage to pay the mortgage and keep the estate afloat for 30 years? Margaret revealed she had been running a forensic accounting firm from the very drafting table they were standing next to. She used her own separate income to fund the house while her family went about their lives. She had maintained this professional practice for 3 decades. In all that time, none of her children had ever asked about the work she was doing in the East guest room. The children viewed their mother as a quiet background figure. They never realized that while they were waiting for an inheritance, she had already secured the deed and the finances in her own name. Margaret pulled a yellowed legal document from her binder and handed it to the lawyer. It was thick paper, marked with a deep official seal. Mr. Harrison adjusted his glasses as he scanned the text. His professional composure shifted as he realized what the document meant for the estate he was there to settle. He read the title deed aloud. The property was owned solely and independently by Margaret Hale. It was not, and had never been, a part of Arthur Hale's estate. The legal reality was final. Arthur's trust, the one the children were beneficiaries of, was empty. As this diagram shows, they had no legal claim to the house or the assets inside it. Sarah went pale. David stared at the lawyer in silence. The inheritance they had been calculating for 3 days had vanished. Margaret looked at the neon sticky notes they had placed on her furniture. She told them that every receipt for every repair, every tax document, and every mortgage payment for 30 years was filed in this room. The children had arrived to divide up a dead man's wealth and push their mother into a facility. They left with nothing because they forgot that while they were watching their father, their mother was keeping the receipts.
The silence in the guest room was heavy, interrupted only by the rain. The children's expectations of inheritance had run directly into Margaret's records. David tried to speak, but he couldn't find the words. The entitlement left his posture, and his face turned red as he realized he was standing in a house he didn't own, demanding money that wasn't there. Sarah looked down at the floor. She was suddenly embarrassed by the neon pink sticky note she had stuck onto the antique grandfather clock just an hour before. Emily looked at the filing cabinets. Looking at 40 years of financial history, she finally saw the work her mother had done to keep the family afloat. David tried to regain his footing. He stammered out an offer to help Margaret manage the sale of the house and find her a smaller place, trying to sound helpful even as his influence evaporated. Margaret stopped him.
She told them that while their father had acted like he owned the estate, she had only allowed it to protect his pride. But her own pride was different. She remembered everything. The decades of paperwork in that room meant the argument was over before it even started. Margaret walked out of the guest room and into the hallway. The children followed her. Their confidence was gone, replaced by the awkwardness of guests who had stayed far too long. In the bright light of the main house, their estate plans felt out of place. The house looked exactly as it always had, but their role in it had changed. They left the attorney behind in the guest room. He was still looking through the files, surprised by how thoroughly Margaret had protected her ownership. Margaret wasn't being managed anymore. She was the one leading them toward the exit. At the front door, Margaret stopped and put her hand on the knob. She told them she wouldn't be forced out of the home she had paid for and saved. She wasn't going to let her children measure her living room for a sale before they even asked how she was doing. She gave them her instructions: peel off the sticky notes, cancel the realtor, and go home. They did as they were told. They spent the next hour peeling neon paper off the mahogany furniture and packing away their clipboards. By the time the last note was removed, the children's claim to the property had disappeared. The only sound left was car doors shutting in the rain. The whispers about the inheritance were gone. The locked room had served its purpose. It kept the truth organized until it was needed to deal with their arrogance. Margaret went back to the living room. It was finally empty and quiet. She sat in her floral chair, picked up her crossword puzzle, and took a slow sip of tea, enjoying a house finally her own again. The victory wasn't in a loud confrontation, but in the silence that followed the facts. If you believe the quietest person in the room is often the one who truly knows where they stand, subscribe to The House They Forgot. Settle in, because the house they forgot may still remember everything.